Hey, how's it going everyone? Nate on the Stone here. Welcome back to my channel. There is a crisis of reading in the United States right now. From 2004 to 2018, the percentage of Americans who read for pleasure on any given day declined from 28 to 19%. Furthermore, just last year, 2019, the Pew Research Center found that 24% of Americans, so we're talking about almost a quarter of the entire population, admitted that they had not picked up a book in over a year. And since reading improves our mental and moral health, that's kind of a big problem. In this environment, you would think that the emphasis, the message that people would want to get out there is the need to read frequently, to read deeply. And it would be if we lived in anything that actually resembled a commonsensical world. However, in light of the fact that insurrections and riots are still happening as we speak, one of the mantras that has been pushed onto us within the last couple of weeks has been, quote-unquote, decolonize your bookshelves. Now that may sound to you like getting rid of an ant infestation behind the bookcase, or making sure that the Lilliputians stop using your books for construction material. But it is actually a very serious mentality that has invaded the world of bibliophiles and reading in general, which seeks to actively resist and overthrow so-called colonialist ideas of storytelling, narration, and literature which have supposedly invaded and pervaded the American psyche. Most recently, Juan Vidal, over at NPR, so this is your tax money at work, asked us to look at our bookshelves and to see what sort of books and authors were on them. Vidal argues that if we find out that most of the books that we have are written by white authors, which creates a homogeneous nature in our personal libraries, then our libraries, and by extension us, are responsible for perpetuating systematic racism because we have allowed these white authors, these white voices, to actually influence how we see the world around us. And quote, how you process the issues of racism and prejudice towards the disenfranchised. In essence, what Vidal argued is that if you only read white authors, or if the majority of authors that you read happen to be white, then what you have done is put on a white voice on loop in your head, which is doing nothing more than simply perpetuating your own worldview. Now, as the sane person, you're probably thinking, what the hell is that? And after that moment of cutting loose, you're probably wondering to yourself how the hell having certain books or the books of certain authors perpetuates racism in any way or oppresses anyone in the 21st century. The answer takes us to a postmodern social theory called, appropriately enough, post-colonialism. A system concerned with accounting for the historical, economic, political, social, and aesthetic impacts of European colonial rule around the world from the 18th to the 20th century. Now, there are several flavors of post-colonialism, but they all share the same cornerstone, the belief that the modern world is completely impossible to understand except through the lens of European imperialism, i.e. white people ruling and oppressing indigenous people. A sane person might timidly raise his hand at this point to remind the teacher that there are no European colonial empires anymore. The powers that actually still had them got rid of them after World War II. That's true, but post-colonialism argues that we are still feeling the effects of colonialism because everything in the world today, from politics to even our standards and products of beauty, are still feeling the lingering effects of empire. And one of those lingering effects, wouldn't you know, happens to be literature. Ideologues argue that white authors used colonial, i.e. oppressive backdrops to write their stories from a white perspective and to justify white domination in every single aspect of life, and in the process get famous, a fame which they still to this day undeservedly have. Alex Nolos wrote in 2018, for example, that while society today now regards imperialism and colonialism as unequivocally and unapologetically evil, it still has a soft spot in its heart for something like Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, holding it up as an exemplar piece of literature, even though, according to Nolos, Heart of Darkness perpetuates quote-unquote horrific colonial narration. This then raises the $64 question, how exactly does someone decolonize their bookshelf? Hope Lee offered 10 different ways in 2019 via 10 different questions. How many authors of color have you read? How many books do you own by local indigenous authors? How often do you read female authors? Have you ever read a book by a queer author? If you have read a book about colonialism, were indigenous voices centered in the story? How many books have you read where the main character is from a marginalized group? Have you ever read an intersectional feminist text before? Put your money where your mouth is. How often do you buy products directly from marginalized groups? Have you read a book that was translated from a non-European language? How often do you engage with local minority groups in your community? Let's pause right there for a second and point out one of the big problems with this whole thing. First, saying that there is a category of white author means that things like time, location, history, culture, language, traditions, the things that actually set us apart and differentiate us from other people and other groups, are absolutely meaningless. In this mindset, there is absolutely no difference between Rudyard Kipling, Jules Verne, and Leo Tolstoy, because all three of them were white. Furthermore, it takes another step and says that, say, J.K. Rowling, Arthur Conan Doyle, Shakespeare, Chaucer, and whoever it was who first wrote down Beowulf, are all basically pretty much the same because, you guessed it, they're all white. Never mind that they lived in completely different eras of English history. Post-colonialism takes all of the real, concrete things that makes us unique, that sets us apart, that actually help feed our sense of identity, and it strips all of those things away from us to put us into this amorphous, tyrannical blob simply based on the color of our skin. And I use the word tyrannical deliberately, gang. Any theory which says at the end of the day that it is impossible for people to have different thoughts, ideas, and philosophies, a theory which says that when you get right down to it, the political philosophy of Thomas Hobbes and the political philosophy of his student John Locke are exactly the same thing with no real difference between them because both Hobbes and Locke were white men, that is a theory that wants to imprison people based solely and utterly on the color of their skin. And if you don't think that's bad enough, gang, then flip it around. If there is this amorphous blob of whiteness into which is stuffed every single pale-skinned person who ever lived, again, regardless of place, time, language, history, culture, traditions, etc., then there is also a corresponding, equally amorphous category of non-white, into which is stuffed every single person whose melanin levels reached a certain point. Think about this. There are 54 countries in the continent of Africa, and there are approximately 3,000 tribes scattered among those 54 countries, some of which include Zulu, Mesa, Yoruba, Ashanti, Chaga, Zoso, Himba, and Oromo. All of these tribes are wonderfully, beautifully different from each other in terms of language, culture, history, and tradition. But stuffed as they are into the blender of post-colonialism, then they just become African or black. Everything that makes the Zulu stand out, apart and proud from every other people and group in the world is rendered absolutely meaningless because post-colonialism says that the only thing that matters is that they are non-white, which means that they are no different from any other person or group who is also non-white. I'll throw down the gauntlet here, actually, gang. Through post-colonialism, Western elites strip people as naked as they stripped the African slaves that they stole in the 17th century. We got a beautiful taste of this when congressional Democrats did their tribute to George Floyd when they put on their quote-unquote African scarves. What no one realized or what no one cared about was that the scarves they were wearing weren't just blandly African or from black culture. They were kente cloths, which come specifically from the Ashanti tribe, which lives in modern-day Ghana. But there is an even deeper problem here with post-colonialism, gang, besides its cultural nihilism and its tyranny. The birth of the theory is often cited as being the publication of a book entitled Orientalism, written by a guy named Edward Said in 1978. Said wanted to describe a standard set of concepts and assumptions to create, evaluate, and interpret knowledge about non-Europeans. And in order to do this, and this is the key part here, gang, in order to do this, he utilized something called discourse analysis, which is a method that was created by Michele Foucault. Now, who the heck was he? Michele Foucault was the postmodernist French thinker of the 20th century. He has also become, unironically, the most cited academic in world history, over 1 million citations as of this recording. Now, we can't get into a deep analysis of Foucault's thought now in this video, but here's the nucleus. Foucault argued that all knowledge is just another aspect of power. In fact, he coined the term power knowledge in order to emphasize this fact. But he also said that all knowledge is socially constructed. This means that what is true is simply what a culture at a specific point in time says is true. Furthermore, because knowledge is just another aspect of power, this means that the dominant forces in a society are what will decide what is true and what will not be true, and they will make these decisions for the sole purpose of preserving and expanding their own power base. The end result is that A, it is completely impossible to compare and contrast the different knowledges of different cultures, and B, knowledge systems that come from dominant cultures, like from the West, are naturally and intrinsically oppressive against non-Western ones. When academics and their parrots say that the scientific method, or empiricism, or objectivity are racist or oppressive, they are channeling Foucault. So to sum up, decolonize your bookshelves is dependent on post-colonialism, which itself is dependent on Foucault's thought. Which in turn means that the entire thing comes crashing down back into the sand because of the Achilles heel in Foucault's thought. If all knowledge systems exist solely to preserve and extend the power of dominant forces in society, then this means that Foucault's system of knowledge is just as equally pragmatic and power-mongering as any other system of knowledge. But even worse for it is this. If all knowledge is socially constructed and there is no such thing as objective truth, then how can it be that Foucault's arguments about knowledge and power and his ideas of systems of power knowledge, how can all of those be taken as the objective lens through which everything else must be filtered? In 2 words, it can't. And with that puncture, the entire idea of decolonize your bookshelf ceases to be an objective observation, something that we must do, that we are compelled to do, and simply becomes another idea, one among millions, that is only true if we choose to make it true. Again, by Foucault's own logic. And here's another aspect that hasn't even been touched on yet: reading. But especially fictional reading, because remember, decolonize your bookshelves applies to fiction and nonfiction. It's all about feeding the imagination. The imagination isn't about fantasy or about thinking of something entirely new. The 19th century historian Thomas Carlyle actually said that originality is not found in novelty, but in sincerity. Imagination is about creating an entire new reality in your head. Fantastic, complex, or simple and bland, it doesn't matter. It's also about understanding the how and why of an idea, its mechanics and soul, as it were. Remember, gang, that the imagination is part of the logos within us, part of that divine fire that allows us to speak poetically and to express ourselves metaphorically, to draw and see connections between different things that on the surface would seem to be completely unconnected. It's the ability to see things from a new perspective, what we might say from another point of view, from another person's eyes, and it is the power to create. This is what allowed our ancestors to create the myths of the god from their observation of nature, even though they themselves were not gods. This is how Asimov and Bradbury were able to create entire new universes in some cases, even though neither one of them had ever left the planet's gravitational field. This is how one of my personal favorite authors, Lloyd Alexander, was able to chronicle how an assistant pig keeper became a man in the land of Prydain. And it's how Agatha Christie, an English woman, created a little Belgian detective who has become so beloved internationally that a town in that country has actually claimed him as its own son. This is also what allowed a little kid to see himself in the faces of Robin Hood, Miles Falsworth, and John Henry, to be swept along by the Arabian Nights and the stories of the Trojan Horse and Odysseus. When you get right down to it, the most insidious thing about Decolonize Your Bookshelf is that it says that your imagination must be warped, shriveled, dried up, and eventually rotted away like an old piece of fruit, not allowed to soar like it's supposed to, not allowed to see the world from another perspective, from another person's eyes, not allowed to create new worlds, new characters, and new people for the delight, pleasure, and illumination of other people. It takes one of the most pleasurable things we should ever do, reading, and turns it into our duty to the ideology, and thereby sucks the humanity out of it and out of us. Don't let them do that to you, gang. Don't let them into your head. Do not let them convince you that you are a bad person or an oppressor simply because you haven't read an intersectionalist feminist text or a queer author. Because the truth of the matter is that you're not. You're being human. You're being free. But as usual, what say you? What stories fed your imagination as a kid? And what stories and authors continue to feed it today? And what sort of stories, authors, and books would you suggest to someone else? As always, let me know your ideas, opinions, and comments in the towel box below. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. Before you go, if you could give the video a like and share it on social media with your friends, I would be very much obliged. And if you like videos about the culture, politics, and religion, but from a unique POV, then don't forget to subscribe and to ring the bell for notifications so that you will always know when I post new videos on here just like this. As always, thank you for watching and for giving me a little bit of your day. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I appreciate you all. And I will see you next week, gang, here on Top of the Stone. And in the meantime, until then, don't forget to dare read, think, speak, and write. I'll talk to you soon. Ciao.